Hello and happy Sunday. I'm Eve and welcome back to my channel. Today we will be discussing chapter 7 from the book History of Yoga All Started on a Stone by Ramis Kachar. And if you've missed any of the previous discussions, I will link them up here so that way you can be sure to check them out. Chapter 7 is titled From East to West and focuses on the modern era of yoga starting in the 1800s and goes all the way up into modern day. According to Ramis, yoga came to the West in about the mid 1800s, and there were several influential yogis or swamis or religious teachers that kind of traveled back and forth and also had a big impact on what we know as modern day yoga. Different parts of yoga began to make their way into the West, and in particular, these typically focused on spirituality and the philosophies that come from the eight-limbed path of yoga. And mostly these parts were considered to be the more desirable aspects of yoga, and there were often stories of the quote unquote strangeness of yogis that were in India at the time. One major event that happened in the 1890s was a meeting of the Parliament of Religions that would meet in Chicago. And in particular, there is one player who made a positive impact and was able to help lay the foundation for modern yoga to take root in the West. And their name is Swami Vivekananda, and overall they were able to leave a positive impression of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. They were able to tweak some of these Eastern beliefs to fit more of a Western audience. The 1900s marked a time when major changes would begin to happen to the practice of yoga, and this is because many European exercises, including primitive gymnastics, started to spread around the world. Many of these postures from gymnastics would fold their way into yoga asanas. A teacher named Krishnamacharya was one of the first yoga teachers to integrate these different postures into yoga. This integration of gymnastics into yoga really laid the foundation for what would become modern yoga. And from this point on, there are a few major players that Ramis mentions. The first person Ramis mentions is Sri Yogendra, and they went on to try to demystify yoga and look for scientific evidence as to the claims behind the benefits of it. The next person is Paramahasana Yogananda, and they went on to spread and popularize Kriya Yoga, which was taught to them by their mentor. And this yoga, Kriya Yoga, is the yoga of action, and it involves using mental states to control physiological ones. Another major player is Tirumalai Krishnamacharya, and in Ramis's words, Tirumalai Krishnamacharya is often called the father of modern yoga, and it is because of his work that yoga is what it is today. As a quick side note, Ramis does go into more detail about these different players who laid the foundation for what would become modern yoga. And in particular, Tirumalai Krishnamacharya has a pretty interesting background about him. So you'll have to read the book in order to find out a little bit more about their backgrounds. Tirumalai Krishnamacharya was well known for their lectures as well as their demonstrations, and was known to teach anyone who would come to listen. In particular, they were known for combining their gymnastics with traditional asanas and pranayama and meditation, which would go on to be known as Vini Yoga and has flow to it, which is what we might know today. Another major event happened in 1947, and this is when India gained its independence from Britain. From my understanding, Krishnamacharya was practicing and lecturing as well as teaching in India. So this changed the climate that he was teaching in. And in fact, around this time period, he also changed who he was teaching and began to focus more on the sick and using yoga to be sort of a type of medicine or an avenue for people to gain back their health. This changed his teaching because he began to focus on more attainable or approachable asanas rather than the more difficult ones that he had started out teaching and demonstrating with. Many of his students would take his teachings and develop their own practices. So I will put his students up on the screen here since there's quite a few of them, and these are only the ones that Ramis mentions. The spread and revival of yoga clearly led to several changes from what it was as an ancient practice into what we know as modern day yoga. And Ramis describes it as a mindfulness physical exercise based on several guiding philosophies and principles. And Ramis notes that these principles are the human body, the principle that we are all unique, that yoga is empowering, and that our minds are crucial for our growth and our health. Lastly, Ramis mentions a few things like that there are not as many gurus as there once were, but instead there are teachers who teach other teachers how to teach asana or how to teach yoga. And I believe that there's a little bit of nuance to this since I believe in the West there is a large focus on the physical aspect of yoga rather than teaching the spiritual side to it. That is the end of chapter 7, which brings us to next week's reading, which is chapter 8, which is titled From One Came Many. We will wrap up with a question, and my question to you is, did you know that gymnastics had an influence on modern day yoga? I did know that gymnastics played a role in modern day yoga. However, I didn't know to what extent, and I've heard a few different stories as to how it made its way into the practice of yoga. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Bye!